Part 1.
You'll hear a mother, Shirley, talking to Kate, an admissions officer at a school. First, you'll have some time to look at questions 1 to 3. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 3.
Good morning. You must be Shirley Peters. My name's Kate.
Yes, hello. I'm Shirley Peters. Nice to meet you.
You have a 10 o'clock appointment with us.
That's right. I'm supposed to go to the admissions office. Is that here?
Yes, it is. Please take a seat as I have several forms for you to fill in to enable you to enrol your son at this school. We have a form for your name, address and so on, one for the health of your son, and one for him to choose extra subjects to join in.
Thank you.
Now, firstly, this form is just so we have a record of your son's personal details. Can you fill it in for me?
Yes, I'll do that now.
Can I just check the details with you? Your son's first name is John.
No, that's his middle name after his father, Richard John. My son's name is Colwyn. Can you please spell it Colwyn, not Colwyn, as some people do?
Yes, I'll make a note of that. And how old is Colwyn?
I've put down that he's entering year 6, so therefore he's 11 years old, turning 12 this year.
So at the moment, he's 11.
Yes, correct.
You now have some time to look at questions 4 to 10. Now answer questions 4 to 10.
Let's move on to your address. Do you live at 7 Watley Crescent, Mount Lawley?
Yes, that's right. The street is spelt Whatley Crescent in Mount Lawley.
Yes, I can see you've written that. Which phone number is best to contact you on?
Well, I'm out and about doing things during the day, so probably my mobile rather than the home number.
So that's 041 3325 888.
Yes, 041 3325 888.
Secondly, can you complete this form regarding your son's health?
Yes, I'll do it for you now.
Thank you. Now, can I go through the more important areas of this form with you to make sure our information is accurate?
Yes, of course.
Is your son taking any medication at the moment that the teachers will need to be aware of?
Yes, he has asthma, so he will be carrying his puffer in his school bag.
So he has a puffer. Is he allergic to anything?
Yes, peanuts. Actually, he should avoid all types of nuts.
That's okay, because we have a policy of not having any nuts in our school. Is there anything else that you think we should be aware of?
As I've written down, he also wears glasses, which he needs to keep on all the time.
I'll highlight that section on the form so his teacher will know about his glasses. Finally, this school has a wide range of interesting subjects that your son can participate in. Could you mark on this form what your son would like to do?
Yes, certainly. Here you are.
Firstly, it seems your son is particularly interested in football, so I'll make a note of that. Secondly, with regard to music, would you like him to start learning the piano in music class?
Yes, that would be fantastic.
Now, turning to art, I'll let his art teacher know that he likes drawing cartoons.
Wonderful.
Finally, let's look at languages now. Did you know that Mandarin was actually only started at the school this year?
Really? Well, I think Chinese would be the most useful, even though my son's friends have already been learning Indonesian and Italian.
Well, now we have all the information we require about your son. We hope he enjoys himself at our school.
I'm sure he will.
That is the end of Part 1.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 2.
Part 2.
You will hear Elliot, an environmental science student, talking to his tutor about an essay he is writing on captive breeding programs.
First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 15. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 15.
Dr. Ran?
Oh, come in, Elliot. Thanks for sending me the draft of your extended essay. Now, you're writing about captive breeding of endangered species, aren't you?
Yes.
Okay. Well, this isn't a bad first draft, but there are some issues I think we need to discuss.
Yes. I wasn't sure if I'd done enough research before I started writing.
I'd say you've got plenty here. Too much in places. You've got this very long introduction on factors threatening the survival of species now and in the future, for instance. It's interesting, but it doesn't address the main issue of this essay.
Oh, I thought I needed to give supporting evidence for my ideas.
Yes, but only for key ideas. You can't cover everything. You've got to focus on the area you've chosen, which is the breeding of endangered species in captivity. Now, you have lots of relevant material about that, but I think you need to look at the planning of your central section again. At present, it's all rather a jumble.
Oh, you mean I need to write it all out again?
Well, it's just a matter of moving the things round a bit. Your introduction needs a rethink, as I said. Why don't you just begin by saying what captive breeding is?
Give a definition.
That's right. Then you should make it clear which are positive points and which are negative ones. For example, you start with the fact that breeding endangered species in captivity may be the only way we have of preserving some from extinction in the years to come, which is clearly an advantage. Now, what other advantages did you mention?
Well, the whole thing about zoos, that since they're the obvious places for captive breeding to take place, this could justify their role in the future. They're not just a place for people to go and stare at animals for fun. And then there's the point that captive breeding eventually allows the animals to be reintroduced to the wild again, in theory at least.
Right. So put those points together. Then the disadvantages.
Well, the point that these programs are very expensive, obviously. Then thinking about the animals themselves, the psychological effects of captivity.
Yes. And you also had a good section on the problem of disease for animals in captivity. But maybe you could have mentioned the poor success rate when they are eventually reintroduced into the wild.
Right.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 16 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 16 to 20.
Now, your next section's on requirements for successful release of these animals into the wild. I think you need some evaluation here. Which of these requirements are more important and which are less important, according to the available data?
I had some information about that, but I wasn't sure if I needed to put it in.
Yes, definitely.
My first point, for example, that's to do with the fact that animals bred in captivity have to be taught how to survive before they're released. All the data shows that's absolutely essential. Unfortunately, if they're just released without training, they won't know how to hunt and how to avoid predators and so on. Some articles suggest that it's necessary, actually, to provide food and shelter for the animals after they've been released, at least for the first few months. But the research suggests that this is less crucial to the successful reintegration of the animals.
Right. You also mentioned the idea of providing employment for local people in the areas where the animals were being re-released, and education, so that they'll see the return of the animals into their habitats as a positive thing.
Yes, that sounds important to me, but I couldn't actually find any statistics or information about it. And I'd have thought it was really important to screen the animals to be sure they were healthy before they were returned to the wild. But the figures show that actually it doesn't make much difference.
That's surprising, yes. Did you get any data on the effects of acclimatisation?
Yes, it showed that if animals are kept on the site where they were to be released for a time in order to acclimatise, they have a far better survival rate than those released directly into the wild.
OK. Well, you've got some good information there. Have you thought at all about your final section?
Well, I think I'll be looking at the whole question of habitat protection and whether in fact captive breeding is the answer, or whether we can protect endangered species within their natural habitat.
That sounds fine. So, I think if you go away and make those changes, that sounds quite promising.
Thank you.
That is the end of part 2.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 3.
You will hear part of a talk on cultural research.
First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 26. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 26.
Having referred briefly to the general definition of culture, I want to move on to an example of cultural research in action, a real example of what researchers into culture are doing. This is a study done in 2004 into the global teenager hypothesis. Now, the global teenager hypothesis states that the values and attitudes of teenagers all over the world have become very similar, that teenagers are part of a global culture, rather than a national or a regional one. This study investigated the subject of materialism in 3 different cultures. It asked if teenagers' attitudes to materialism were similar or different in those 3 different cultures. I'd like to go through the main points of this study because I think it demonstrates the interest and usefulness of this kind of research. The research took a sample of 556 high school students of between 14 and 17 years of age from 3 countries. The 3 countries, being also 3 differing cultures, were China, Japan, and the USA. The high schools were in medium-sized cities, and the students came from middle-class areas. There were 172 respondents from China, 168 from Japan, and 216 from the USA. The students were asked to reply to a questionnaire or survey, which consisted of 7 statements. They were asked to say if they agreed or disagreed with the statements. The questionnaire was filled in during the students' regular class time. I'll give you some examples of the statements in the questionnaire. And, by the way, if you want to look into this in further detail, I've got the reference here. Let me see. Oh yes, it's the International Journal of Consumer Studies, Volume 28, Number 4, of September 2004. The first statement was, "It is really true that money can make you happy." Respondents were asked, as they were asked about all the statements, to give their answer on a scale of 1 to 7. 1 on the scale indicated, "I strongly disagree." 4 on the scale was neutral. And 7 on the scale was, "I strongly agree." The second statement was, "My dream in life is to be able to own expensive things." And the fifth was, "Having the right possessions is the most important thing in life." Let's look at some of the results.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 27 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 27 to 30.
I'm sorry.
Let's look at some of the results. With regard to the first statement, it was the Japanese teenagers who agreed most strongly that money could make you happy. The Americans were second, and the Chinese agreed least. However, regarding one's life dream being to own expensive things, it was American teenagers who agreed most strongly with this, and the Chinese who agreed least. As regards the fifth statement about owning the right things, the Americans agreed less strongly than the other 2 groups. It was the Chinese who agreed most strongly with this statement. I haven't been able to analyse all aspects of the study in this lecture, but it does suggest that the hypothesis is not supported by the data. It may be that the culture of the USA is more individualistic, whereas the Chinese culture is more collectivist or communitarian. However, it does not seem to support the global teenager hypothesis. As always, this is something on which we need to carry out more research.
That is the end of part 3.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 4.
Part 4. Listen to the conversation between Andrew and Samantha. Complete the summary by writing one suitable word in the numbered spaces.
First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Does your work bring you into contact with many overseas students, Samantha?
Occasionally. As you know, a solicitor's work is to advise people about their rights when they have any problems understanding how the law operates. They may need help because of injury to themselves or their property, if they've been attacked or robbed, for example. But these are not by any means the main problems I deal with.
Really? We know more about crime, I suppose, because we read about it in the newspaper or see it on TV. What other things do people come to you for help with?
There are lots of things which don't get nearly so much attention. Sometimes it's to do with relationships in the community, as when bills aren't paid or contracted work isn't completed or neighbours disagree. At other times, it's to do with people not understanding the law and their responsibilities, and this is probably where overseas students have the most difficulty. One interesting example is customs laws, something which every new arrival has to come up against.
What is it that overseas students find most difficult to understand about Australian customs regulations?
I think it's a shock to many people arriving here for the first time to find out how many things are prohibited. Everyday food items, for example. I mean, when I've been travelling overseas, I've been quite amazed at the lack of concern in some countries about food being brought in from other parts of the world without any check.
You mean people arriving into other countries don't have to declare any foodstuffs at all?
In some countries, there are lots of warnings about drugs and firearms, and there are usually limits on alcohol and tobacco, and perhaps perfume. But food's not mentioned.
Yes, I suppose I never thought about it till I came here. You can take anything you like into England as far as food is concerned.
You see, here, you can't even drive from one state to another with a few apples and oranges for the journey. There are signs to remind you not to bring any fruit into some states, though they don't usually search your bags unless there's a fruit fly epidemic or something.
With those kinds of regulations between states, it's no wonder that they're so strict about what you can bring in from overseas. Of course, farmers would be wiped out if some pests were introduced which destroyed their whole crop. It's easy to understand why you should take steps to prevent that.
And with food being such an important part of many cultures, it can be difficult for some people to realise they're not allowed to bring in delicacies from home for friends and relatives here. I'm defending someone at the moment who has exactly that problem.
Oh, what happened?
It's an interesting case. Have you got time for a cup of coffee? I'll tell you about it if you like.
That'd be great.
That is the end of part 4.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.